John Stevens gave out the following message in Meher Baba's presence during the 1956 American tour.
Baba has asked me to tell all of his lovers that he speaks with divine authority, that he is the highest of the high, and that same ancient one. Baba also says that when he breaks his silence, then the whole world will realize that he is the one for whom all have awaited.
John Stevens gives a background on the Discourses of Avatar Meher Baba.
I originally discovered the Discourses when the Sufis discovered Baba, or he discovered us, 20 years ago, and started reading them at that time, thought that I had pretty well mastered them after a few years. But oddly enough, as I started rereading them in the mid-50s, which was almost 10 years after I had originally run across them, I was astonished by all of the new things that I started finding in them. And just went on for a while, put them aside again. And in the early 60s, we became aware of the fact that the Indian edition of the Discourses was running out. In fact, there were only certain volumes that were available at that point. So we became rather alarmed and said, well, there's some obvious typographical errors in the old edition. And once in a while, a badly inverted sentence or two. So what we really ought to do is to reprint the Discourses in a slightly edited version. And that started what turned out to be about a 3-year work. It turned out to be much more intensive than we had any idea. I was up to my neck in them for 2 solid years, and all during that time, absolutely stunned by all of the things that I had never seen before in the Discourses. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the background of the Discourses, the manner in which they were given out. The Discourses were given out in the very late 30s and early 40s, just as war was beginning to rampage all across the world. There are a number of things that Baba says in various different chapters which are obviously in the context of the world holocaust. I do want you to feel that although many of you are aware that Baba has been involved in the silence for over 40 years, that the things that he has given out do represent Baba. And they represent Baba in the most important works that he's given out, such as God Speaks, for instance, in most meticulous detail. They are aimed at people who do have a very, very deep intent to go forward in their own spiritual ongoing, and who have a deep commitment to that ongoing. The original edition of the Discourses was edited by a PhD in India, Dr. Deshmukh. He's been around Baba for a very long time, a professor of philosophy in one of the universities in India. His native language, of course, is not English. It is his second language, and that is why some of the original English was a bit awkward. But in the new edition, which is available now, there have been no major changes. All that we have done is to do a bit of the obvious reversal of sentence structure when it had to be done. I think that the Discourses, to me, represent, let us say, Baba's intimate, detailed descriptions, suggestions, teachings in relation to day-to-day living as it would be lived by the individual who feels that he has to go ahead in his own inner life. They make the greatest sense if the individual takes them in combination with God Speaks. God Speaks is a very precisely, concisely, carefully woven together philosophical work of the origins of creation, what it's all about, where it's going, what the individual soul is doing here, what has to happen to him. So if one can wrestle with that very tightly reasoned structure that Baba gives out in God Speaks, and then, as it were, put the cross arm on it, which is the Discourses, then one has quite a fantastic combination, the philosophy of the thing and the practical way of going about it.
Commentaries on the Discourses of Avatar Meher Baba by John Stevens. Part 1, The God-Man.
You're all aware of the fact that the avatar comes when the identification with materiality has become almost absolute. It's sort of a glib way of saying something that is terribly important in people's lives. What it means is that an avatar has to come along and ungel the situation when your parents and my grandparents, and so on, were getting to the point where all that they could associate with reality was how many rooms there were in the house, and how many flush toilets there were, and whether there was a car, and whether or not one had 2 suits in the closet or 5 suits in the closet, and whether one's hair ought to be combed this way. All of life, let us say, the values that one associates with life have become completely involved with materiality or one's relationship to other material objects, so that the inner life, the inner spark, has completely died out of life. Well, what happens in a situation like that, of course, is that the individual becomes very much identified with a routine in life as well. One goes to the office, and one goes through certain routines, and one earns a certain amount of money, and one concludes that the next desirable goal is to be promoted from the clerkship to the assistant managership, and then that naturally is followed after 2 or 3 or 4 years by being appointed manager, and if one really works hard at these sort of things, eventually one gets to be assistant vice president, and so on and so on. So these are the sort of things that, when this becomes virtually 100% of one's association with what is reality, this is when the avatar has to come along and put an atom bomb underneath the situation. So, routine, a very unimaginative approach to life. What starts happening at that time? And for 2 reasons. The next generation starts to go into revolt for it, partly because the next generation that is being born into the world is a generation which knows it has access, it is attracted by the fact that there is going to be a great one in the world, and so individuals who have the capability of more than that begin to be born into the situation. They're also born into a situation which is so devoid of inner value that instinctively they start to go into rebellion against it. Now, that's the point where I want to pick up the story. I've sketched the part so far that you're completely familiar with as to why an avatar is necessary and what the high signs on the high road are of when he comes in. But let's then start to analyze the anatomy of the reaction of the young men at that point. And I just want to talk about something that I feel terribly deeply and very, very sincerely about, because there is a challenge that is involved here, and it's a terribly tough hurdle that's got to be gotten over at that point. When one looks at a situation which is completely stalemated because of the lack of imagination and appreciation of true value, of course what one does instinctively and automatically is to go over to the opposite side of the pendulum. So everything that was routine, everything that was identified with sheer materiality becomes, let's say, negative to one. Unconsciously and quite honestly and quite truthfully, the individual reacts, because when one sees the vacuum of value on this side, one says, all right, value must be the reverse of that. I don't say that an individual will sit down and think logically about this, but this is the instinctive reaction that the individual has. And so as a consequence, if materiality is obviously paying out nothing at all in the way of inner value, of true value, one says then, therefore, value must be completely dissociated from materiality. If the old system that one is absolutely fed up with and wonders how under the sun one's parents ever got along with it is associated with routine, then one concludes that routine is a big, bad bear, and that that's got to be broken down. Please understand me, I'm talking sincerely with you. I'm not building up a case to get in some sort of a dagger and drive it up into a situation. I want to explain just as honestly as I can how something comes up which in turn represents a further problem and a further challenge, and this is what you people have to resolve. So as one sees these various things, the routines, the identification with materiality, excess value placed on social standing, prestige, things of this sort, one tends to toss them into the ash can. If one sees folks, parents, who get themselves too involved in sort of glib parties where everybody is drinking too much and eating too much and obviously saying insincere things, then one has a reaction and one doesn't want to be around crowds. There are all these things that one reacts against in life, and the tendency is to react exactly to the opposite extreme. And this is natural, absolutely natural. I want to describe it as natural so that you can see that this is an inevitable consequence, but in turn leads to a further challenge that the individual has to begin to come to grips with. All right, so then what happens? All right, somewhere about this time when there is a great deal of rebellion against the old systems and the old values, and let's say enough charges of dynamite have been put under the older generation so that it is shaken. And maybe it does a certain amount of swearing at the ineptness and the lack of responsibility and maybe the unkemptness of the new generation. Still, it is shaken because there is enough that they recognize instinctively inside of themselves as being the honesty and the truthfulness of these judgments, so that they don't just dismiss them case out of hand. It doesn't happen. So here you have a situation which becomes very uneasy. All sorts of unrest is in the atmosphere. And you have a generation which then is swinging to an opposite of the things of what their parents and their grandparents had done, the manner in which they went about life. All right, this is the entry line for the avatar. And he comes along, and he starts saying a few things, and he puts some real blockbuster charges in the air, too. He starts stirring up the situation. He puts clues in the air, and he tackles certain individuals through internal leads, and he arranges strange coincidences by which you run across this trail. And this all seems rather extraordinary, and all sorts of fun stories crop up about, well, how did you meet the avatar, or how did you ever get onto the fact there was a Baba in the world? And it is. It's great fun. It's great sport. And one recognizes certain things instinctively about him. And so you begin to trust an individual of this sort and of this caliber. This is terribly important. Because before that, you were rebelling, and you were looking, but you had nothing to latch on to. And then, suddenly one finds a real clue. And one says, this looks good. This looks healthy to me. And I want to make something of this. And so you get down and you start studying some of the things that Meher Baba has given out, and start working away at the things that he is saying. You begin to understand a little bit of what he says creation is, where it came from, where it's going, some of the things that perhaps an individual can do to help these processes along. And from that original clue, which matched your own longing and searching, you have the strength to carry along through a certain amount of, let us say, the gaff, the disciplining that's involved in what the avatar is saying about the function of life, its purpose, and how to go about it. Somewhere about this time, you start finding out, for instance, that creation, an organized life, has a certain reason for it. Creation is the vehicle by which this key important thing, God's realization of his own divinity, consciously can come about. And so one finds that there is a reason for creation. It's not just something that is to be gotten rid of. One begins to find out that there is something extraordinarily basic called samskaras that Baba makes a great deal about. And you begin to understand little bit by little bit that all of human life now, from the human stage on, is occupied with gradually unraveling and wearing out and chopping through these samskaras. And you begin to find out that these samskaras can't be dealt with effectively unless you put yourself right back into the same environment that produced them. You say, oh, God, that's nauseating, but I guess maybe that's the way one has to go about it. And so one begins to understand little bit by little bit that the things that one thought before were hideous and that one had to escape from are actually the things that one has to go back to and subject oneself to again, but with a new insight as to what is involved. One begins to understand, too, that you don't reject society, because this is the great proving ground in which the samskaras wear out. They just don't wear out in a vacuum. They don't wear out in a cave. They don't wear out in splendid isolation. No, that isn't what wears out samskaras. One has to subject oneself to society. One finds out that society is also, let's say, terribly important as the milieu, the environment, in which one begins to rediscover such a thing as unity. One finds out that love springs up in relation to another individual, but also in relation to many individuals. So much, perhaps almost all, of what one was repelled and revulsed by, one finds that one has to go back and start to make one's peace with it. And it's absolutely extraordinary to see how people will take on, realistically, honestly, this sort of a load over a period of time and go right back into the middle of many things, trying to make their peace with them. But now we're getting into, this is the sort of thing we've been talking about for months and months and months, the reasons for creation, the reasons for organized society, how a mystic looks upon these things. This part of the story you also know terribly well. But the thing that I've been thinking so much about in recent weeks is then the further part of what starts to crop up about that time. Very often an individual, when he starts to put the thumb screws back on himself and say, all right, I've got to find the guts to wade back into these things and to find a way of making my peace with many of these. I've got to keep my own freshness and honesty, and yet obviously I've got to go back and live in the world and integrate with it. And so every once in a while an individual, well, let's say as it were, turn the thumb screws on considerably harder, almost unconsciously. One doesn't just, let's say, go from one extreme to another extreme and then settle down in some sort of a healthy, beautiful, golden mean at all. When one starts to rediscipline oneself, unconsciously one assumes that all discipline is a good thing. And as a consequence, there is a tendency to over-discipline oneself and to overturn the thumb screws that are involved in a situation like this. There are all sorts of things that begin to crop up that are terribly challenging at this time. When one was originally in the stage of rebellion, let me go back. I'll probably go back and forth here a half a dozen times and get you dizzy and get me dizzy too, but maybe through it all, we'll follow through something that I think is terribly real and awfully challenging. As an individual, let's say, reacted to the staidness and the lack of juice of the parental situation as it tended so often to be in past decades in your childhood, one, in going to the extreme, idealized an undisciplined life, an unstructured life. This is the sort of thing, let's say, that I suppose probably the anarchists of the early 1900s were reacting against. They were reacting against the overly staid, stuffy, terribly cruel and brutal type of industrialization that came up in the late 1800s. And so they reacted against that. They wanted freedom and they wanted air and so on. And so what did they do? They went completely to the reverse, into an anarchistic approach to life, where they glorified and idealized complete, utter lack of restraint. As they would put it, complete freedom. They didn't even want restraint, let's say, by a formalized government. Even that was suffocating. And this tends to be, let's say, at some point or another, a type of a reaction that the individual comes to. But then he runs across a Meher Baba and he realizes, no, that type of internal anarchism can't be. It's too great a luxury, and it doesn't get anywhere. And so one comes back to the disciplining. But as that disciplining goes along, there are several problems that come along, and I've already outlined the first one to you. There tends to be somewhat of an over-screwing of the thumb screws, because one begins to try to do too good a job, almost. There's another thing that comes along, strangely enough, at about the same general time, and that is that you begin to find that the habit patterns of rebellion and the somewhat anarchistic tendencies that one inevitably develops in such a period of rebellion, they're habit patterns too. And they want their due. They don't wear out just simply and easily overnight, because Meher Baba says that life and society are the great laboratory. And there's still a third thing, too, that comes along that terribly complicates the picture. Baba outlines this to us. It's awfully hard to deal with, and that is the ego begins to be frightened, to feel challenged, and so it automatically begins to assert itself in all sorts of strange fashions. So after the individual has started to rediscipline himself for a certain period of time, he suddenly comes to grips with three major things that are tough. And I said I wanted to talk to you a little bit this evening just about life and the problem. This is what I'm talking about. What begins to happen when an individual has gone a certain way in the spiritual path with love and devotion
and loyalty to a Meher Baba. Let me repeat them again. You will very often find, not consciously, intellectually, but by reaction, that perhaps he has over-disciplined himself. Over-disciplined in relation to what he can actually accomplish at that moment. Secondly, he finds that his old, happy-go-lucky habit patterns of non-discipline were real habit patterns, and he longs for them. This is another real problem. They're not worn out. And thirdly, he begins to find that something within himself begins to rear itself and object to this business of losing one's identity. And there are all sorts of reasons and attractive formula which begin to crop up for reasserting oneself. And this produces a tremendous turmoil, an enormous turmoil if one is honest about it. Sometimes one tends to assign it over here and say, oh, maybe this is my trouble at this point. Sometimes one tries to say, oh, gee, maybe my love life isn't quite right. I seem to be growing a little stale. Or maybe one says, oh, this business of the mystic path, it's great, but gee whiz, I guess maybe I'm just not cut out for it. These are inevitable sort of reactions that an individual has when he's gone sincerely, carefully, to a certain stage in his ongoing. What very often happens at that point is that the individual, a crude individual, and there aren't many who do this, will simply, let's say, pick a scapegoat and say, yeah, I don't want anything of that because so-and-so. Maybe they suddenly say, oh, Meher Baba passed away and I don't see any signs of his manifestation. He always said he was going to break his silence. I've never seen him break his silence. I hear a lot of people arguing eruditely about this, but I think it's a lot of malarkey. I think he just fell down on the job. Or maybe one says, here in England, there's too much politics that goes around. I've had a belly full and I want to go up and do something else. This is too complicated. That person is wrong or something. But it's not often that an individual, let's say, assigns a scapegoat in order to get outside of a situation like that. Usually, let's say one says, I don't think that philosophy is quite right. But at any rate, there are these various different reasons that an individual may toss up in order to toss in the sponge and not go further. This is real, this is tough, and it takes a great deal of determination and a great deal of insight for an individual to go along in such a situation as that. Very often you will see an individual who has gone for quite some considerable period of time just unexplainably cut off ties. Very often this is simply because of the fact that the ego has taken such a battering to that particular point that it simply mounts a tremendous counteroffensive, but won't even label any particular area as being the area of counteroffensive. Believe me, your own internal ego is a real thing, and as I've said a number of times, it's almost as if it had its own independent life. And when that quasi-independent life is seriously challenged, it will tackle almost any type of situation, take on almost any sort of an excuse in order to blow it sky high, to reassert itself, to give itself another lease on life. You know as well as I do that in the long run, one's own individual ego is it can't go on. It's dead sooner or later. But it's a terribly long time in dying, and believe me, it puts up a tremendous battle. So, as a consequence, there is this very, very tough period that an individual inevitably goes through. And this isn't just because of, let's say, a lack of zip or a lack of inspiration or something of this sort. It's because one is getting down to the real tough part of ongoing. This is the part where, let's say, nothing in the way of inspiration can be of any particular help to the individual. It just comes from one's own honest facing of it out and saying to oneself, what is inevitable? What is the truth? What do I know way down inside of myself is the truth? And then facing up to the truth. You know, I've talked on 1 or 2 or maybe 10 occasions about the inevitability of the truth. There is such a thing as truth. And there is absolutely no way in the long run that you or I or any other being can escape long-term the truth. And so when an individual starts on the spiritual path, when he has formed his link to a great one such as a Meher Baba. He is starting out on the path, and it is the truth that he is going to end up with sooner or later. But it is tough. He's going to have an awful lot of reactions that are involved in the way, and there is nothing in the way of, let's say, inspiring talk or just force of logic that is going to keep the individual going along the path. And this phase of the game, what keeps him sticking to it is because he has had to become so deeply honest inside of himself that he knows he has got no other choice. And he has to become so deeply honest with himself that he knows instinctively that any individual trying to associate himself with him at that point is doing it simply in order, in some way or another, to help in this tough circumstance that has to be gotten through. Before an individual, let's say, perhaps has the type of compensating internal experiences where there's a good deal of bliss and happiness that is brought along. One doesn't have the sustainment, let us say, at that point that is brought along. The original euphoria, the love of coming across as magnificent and as splendid a creature as a Meher Baba has worn just a little bit. One has gotten a bit used to the fact that there is such a sublime being around. One has gotten perhaps just a little blasé about it. This is the tough haul period. And, as I say, it is tough for at least these three major reasons that are involved. So, one has perhaps a tendency then to go back to an undisciplined, one may say to oneself, as too straight-laced. No, that isn't really it. That isn't what one is fighting against. One may say, no, it isn't for me. No, that isn't what one is fighting against. There are all of these different things, but what the individual is really up against is trying to face out the truth. Then, what can help in a situation like that? Love. That helps tremendously. The sort of love, let's say, that you get from people who have been associated with Baba. You go to Delia, and Delia sits and talks feelingly with you, and that gives you a bit of warmth. You go ring Hildy's doorbell, and you get a tremendous amount of warmth and sustainment from her, and that gives you courage to face into a situation. You sometime or another break through Stevens's business trips, and you sit down and chat with him, and he talks perhaps long and honestly and searchingly with you, and that gives you a certain amount of courage to go along. But you know, there are other things in addition to this that one has to try to do for oneself, if one can. And that is just to say, no, I can't afford the luxury at this point in my life of making excuses anywhere along the line. I've got to face into this, and I'm responsible for a lot of the technique that is involved here. Let me say this. The reason that I brought out this business of, let's say, turning the thumb screws one turn too tight is because there is nothing at all about Baba and the spiritual path that says anything about spirituality being dry and painful. There is painfulness involved, but there's also tremendous exhilaration involved too. So one of the things that an individual can do in his own life and has a deep responsibility for. I can't do it for you. Delia can't do it for you. Hildy can't do it for you. This is where you have to take on a certain responsibility in your own life, and that is the balancing out of this too. Sure, there's the taking back on of discipline in your life and structuring your life, but it isn't all that. And on the other hand, a return to an anarchistic, a completely unstructured way of life, that's not the answer either. These are two extremes. One leads to degeneration. The other leads to complete spiritual dryness. That doesn't lead to juice and vitality and reality. It's the fire between these two elements of being able to say to oneself in certain situations, it's my responsibility and I'm going to do it. And it also consists in saying to oneself in another situation, this is the time to blow the lid off and have a fun and a frolic, and to insist on it, and to organize one's life so that it shall be that way. One has a responsibility in both directions. But again, believe me, one cannot find the answer in 100% of the one or 100% of the other. You will never find spirituality in something that is as dry as bone and simply the tightening of the thumb screws through further disciplining and further disciplining and further disciplining. Spirituality is not that. It just isn't. And on the other hand, spirituality and internal development is not, let's say, just the unstructured following of one's nose spontaneously. That doesn't happen to be it either. And this will simply lead to the disintegration of the individual if he goes on too long following it. It comes from finding an intuitive balance, and sometimes it's a great deal of disciplining oneself for a considerable period of time, because every once in a while life turns up a period where for weeks or even months, by golly, the responsibilities just come awful darn fast. They're there. And so you buckle down and say, all right, this is the sort of dry period. And you wade in and you just hope that you don't run out of steam before it's done. But sooner or later, it will be done. Now, an individual, let's say, who hasn't gotten inside of himself when the crisis period and the disciplining period is done for the moment, what he usually tries to do is to look around and see what else he ought to be disciplining himself and pouring all of his time and energy into. Not at all. If there's anything that I can give you tonight that can be a tremendous clue to something of great value, it is to tell you that at that point you must say to yourself, this is my breather period. This is my fun period. This is my relaxation period. And deliberately going about it. It happens. You will have them. They come to you for good reason. They allow you to catch your breath. They allow you to remake your balance. They allow you to recreate the springs of just sheer fun and frolic that are so terribly important. But believe you me, then that period, in turn, is followed by another period in where there's a job that's got to be done. And you can't push it off. You can't neglect it, and then you buckle down. But if an individual tries to be, let's say, all structuring, and if he tries to be all discipline, he is not going to have the steam and the spontaneity and the juice to last out the thing. So it's a balancing between the two in the long run for which he has the responsibility. Again, this is not something that I can do for you. It's not something that Delia can do for you. And it's not something that Hildy or Adi or Joyce or the Hopkinsons or your close friend. It's not something that another individual can do. It is something that you take on as your own responsibility. It is too quick-moving, and it is too fast, and it is too personal, and it is too spontaneous a thing for another person to do anything more than to suggest the general outlines to you. But if you find, let's say, that you don't have the time and the energy to do this, what it means is you've got to go in very deeply and honestly into your own personal life and say, what is happening to my own personal life, my family life, my relationship life? Why don't I have? Why don't I allow myself to have the time for these things? And you will begin to find out that there are certain adjustments that you can make. I've talked about this any number of times in somewhat different contexts in the past. But at a period that you're all going into now, because you've been around Baba for a good chunk of time now, and you're well beyond the sort of initial, just lovely, isn't it wonderful knowing Baba and living at a time when the strength and the force of Baba is so much in the world. You're beyond that period, and you're into the middle hall period, where the problem that I've just outlined to you is there. And it's fast-moving, it is terribly important, and it is terribly real, and it is necessary for the individual to have some sort of a grip on this, to be able to judge the situation himself. And if you find in your own personal life, in your business life, your responsibilities, that you don't have the time, the energy, and the impulse to, every once in a while, just have your spontaneous fun and frolic, and do it on your own, and to be your own natural source of it, all right, then you've got to go back and look into what are the things that are soaking your own life dry. This isn't what a Baba would want. My gracious, Baba with all of his tremendous responsibilities in relation to all of creation. I've never been around Baba when he was in complete drastic seclusion, but I have been around him at times when he's been in semi-seclusion, when the bars were pretty well up, and when he was doing very intensively his universal work, various other things that he was getting out of the way. What would he do, even at those times? Perhaps he would allow me, let's say, to come in for an hour or something like that. And part of that time would be a game of La Risque, where, Baba cheats unmercifully, and where you rub your nose on the ground or on the stone floor. There's the balance in the thing. I don't know what all Baba would do, let us say, after he would leave the Mandali Hall and go up and be with the girls, Money and Mera and Goher and Nadja, Meru, Mera. But I am sure of this, from the little things that Money has told me, that there was tremendous relaxation and a good bit of just fun that was involved in this. The avatar himself provides in his own life for the balance. What did Baba do, let's say, after a period of being out and being with hundreds and thousands of people and absolutely exhausting himself? He just didn't repeat that pattern every day. Not at all. He would go back and he'd be almost completely unavailable for some period of time. He wouldn't be lazy in these periods, but there's the contrast and there's the balance that is involved in these things. This is what is so important in the long haul. And again and again and again, this type of a balance and the shifting from one type of life to the other, from one type of responsibility to the relaxation, is so terribly essential. And this is where the individual has to start to come to grips with the thing. You can't afford the luxury of trying to make your life all responsibility. Just as you absolutely cannot afford to make your lives simply the unstructured, the undisciplined, and the so-called purely spontaneous. It's equally fallacious. But the individual has the responsibility of feeling this out and beginning to form his life so that this can happen, and he does make it happen. There is nothing, I know absolutely nothing under the sun that gives me the willies more than an individual who talks about taking strength from Baba's work. And believe me, there are a lot of them in this world. Individuals who drive themselves 18 hours a day, 365 days of work, doing Baba's work. Believe me, these are the people who end up not doing Baba's work. These end up being the dry husks, because they don't realize that they themselves have a responsibility for finding balance. This is a misconception on their part. Baba doesn't protect a person from insanity. If an individual is bound because of his own ego drive to interpret Baba in a certain fashion, Baba doesn't arrange for the stroke of lightning to come down and balance that person. No, he teaches him a tough lesson so that he doesn't get involved in the same sort of a booby trap again. So it's you and me who have to feel out these things, and Baba will give the clue. This you can depend upon. But putting it into application, it calls for you and me. So find in your own personal life the opportunity to have these relaxed periods, to have the just spontaneous periods. These are real. This is part of the balance. And this will allow you to go back into the tough crisis times. It will allow you to go back into the responsible, structured aspects of your life and take on the things that have to be done. Too much. We tend to split these things. I suppose there's probably been more argument about, let's say, disciplining and the unstructured than on any other subjects that I know in relation to Baba. And there's some people who feel that it's all this, and there's some people who feel that it's all of that. But it isn't either the one or the other. It is combination and balance in one's own individual life. And don't let anybody argue you out of it, but it's got to be all this way or it's got to be all that way. But you're the person in your life and in your own internal life who knows where the balance has got to be. You want to talk about this because, really, this is life. This is life. And this is the sort of a type of a challenge that is so terribly tough to deal with. You and I want to make these things all black or all white. It's so much easier that way. But it just doesn't happen to be that way.
Suppose the ego, rather than fighting the new disciplines and trying to pull you back into your old self, actually latches on to those new disciplines.
As Baba says so beautifully in one of the discourses, the spiritual life itself can be latched onto by the ego as a further way of perpetuating itself. It can swing in either direction. It can try to force the individual back into a completely individualistic stand, or it can say, see what a spiritual person I am. It is so tough, and it is so subtle. I mean, all that an individual can do is just keep being honest and honest and honest, and try to look just as clearly as one can.
Don, could you say more about losing a sense of identity?
Ah, yes, that was back in the part of, let's say, what one begins to re-find as a part of a legitimate function of society and one's relationship to it. What the individual is doing is, A, he is wearing out sanskaras. He is beginning to crumble this wall of separateness of his own sense of separate identity, and he is beginning to try to find love and unity. And the losing of one's own separate sense of identity. You know, Baba says that one of the most direct and straightforward fashions by which this may occur is to substitute a temporary ego in the form of one's identification with the guide or the master. Really, this is one of, let's say, the two great functions of the guide or the master, the other simply being to love one, to accept. But, you know, this is so terribly misunderstood. In fact, it's almost impossible in our Western tradition to accept this because it is looked at with such tremendous suspicion. But if one can become so trustful of another individual as a guide, and so loving, and so certain that that other individual has your best welfare at heart, so as to lose oneself for a period of time in that other person, this is one of the most valuable things that can happen to one. As I say, when one did it with a Baba, not because a Baba or any legitimate spiritual guide needs that building up of their own identity, but it acts as a tremendous assist in the individual crumbling this hard shell of the ego and to begin to lose this sense of separateness, complete separateness of identity. One of the two real reasons for a guide. And this, of course, one's own ego function resists like fury, because this is absolute anathema. Everything that the ego can find to pick a flaw or a hole in this sort of a trend, or in the individual who is, let's say, trying to function as a guide or as a spiritual master. It does. And in the long run, to be perfectly honest, if you can lose yourself in another individual, let's leave spiritual guide or perfect master completely outside of it. If you're lucky enough to be able to lose yourself in another individual to the point that they just move their little finger, it makes no difference whether that is a magnificent person or a reprehensible person. You've gotten the good out of that just through the sheer release of your own identity that goes on. Because, boy, this puts a depth charge into the sense of separate identity from which it never completely recovers. You may go back to being a relatively egoistic individual again, but never anywhere to the degree that you were before. You develop a softness and an ability to identify with other people internally that you never lose.
Suppose that the person you depend on lets you down.
Completely. Absolutely. This is the spiritual law, that what you put into the situation, regardless of the spiritual guide, it's what you put into the situation that redounds to your benefit. It depends on what the individual goes through. If you lose your identity, even if it is in a myth, all right, it does just that much to your own sense of separateness. One of the things that struck me as a kid was the amount of, let's say, building of character on the part of a kid who could have a great case of hero worship for some great athlete or some great political figure, something of this sort. It is. It is a good thing, in my opinion. And I've seen a great deal happen to an individual. Even, let us say, when the hero figure was torn down so often, deserted and neglected, still there is an inbuilding of a type of character that goes on that is of tremendous value. One of the things I feel so sad about is that because of our general cynicism, there are so few individuals that one is willing to worship anymore. One is so convinced that they all have feet of clay, and that one ought not to be a sucker and gets sucked into that type of misplaced devotion. but one doesn't. One doesn't lose by them. The substitution of the counter-ego of the guide doesn't go on indefinitely. It goes on for a period of time to accomplish a very good purpose. So, one can put it in the past tense for either of two reasons, that the individual has been given back, as it were, the further part of the dealing with his own ego, which he is then prepared and equipped to do. Or secondly, if the individual has become disillusioned and said, oh, this individual wasn't what I thought he or she was, and withdraws, quite frankly, very often what it means is that the individual had not made a real transference to the guide involved in such a particular circumstance. Because if there is a real transference, one finds real love and real devotion. You remember the story that I've told you so many times, Milarepa. You recall Milarepa's experience of adoring his master, who was actually a black magician. And then when the guide himself said, I am a black magician, insisting that he still loved him, this was real, this was deep, this was sincere. And so as a consequence, both Milarepa and the black magician were given the right to study under a true master. So I say this, if an individual is thrown off of making a deep internal sense of identity and transference by some apparent flaw in character, or real flaw in character, it usually means that the individual had retained most of his ego nature and was not putting that on the block, as a matter of fact. Because when there is a real transference that is involved, and something in which real shattering of the ego can go along, it doesn't matter whether you find out that that person did or did not break his silence, or that that person is or is not 1,000% ethically honest in this situation or that. Let's say, then you have the right to further assistance dependent upon the fullness with which you really went about this question of identification with the guide. If you sincerely and honestly put yourself into it, and then, let us say, the person fell down and there finally was just nothing else that you can do, all right, you have earned the right to a real guide in that case. And it will come fairly fast. I don't mean necessarily it will come in a year or 2 or even 20 years, but if an individual has sincerely put great faith and great trust into the situation, they will then have earned the right to the real guide. Baba says so beautifully, surrenderance is a succession of surrenderances. You just find deeper and deeper, deeper levels within your own being, which come as challenges, which one must surrender. And you recognize that as a further, at first, when it first happens to you, you think, oh, I'm sort of superficial and shallow. I thought I'd surrendered, but I really didn't. Here I've got all of these doubts. And this is the point where an individual will very often kick himself. In fact, he may be so disillusioned with himself at such a point that he gives up trying to go ahead for a period of time, says, I'm just not up to it. But no, there are layers and layers and layers of surrenderance that one goes into deeper and deeper and deeper. The finding of unity with another person is never reached until finally one as God realized oneself, and so the process of surrenderance continues.
To what extent does emotion come into it? Sometimes you may make some sort of a surrender which has got a lot of emotion involved.
There is a vast, vast difference between, let's say, the type of quick impulsive emotion. This is a thing one has to be so careful about in real internal working. Very often an individual will be caught with a flash flood of feeling and make an impulsive gesture, or it's sort of, let's say, like a quick smash on a beautiful girl, you know, and you're just absolutely captivated. And then 2 weeks later, you look at her and think, God, what did I ever see in her? Why, actually, she's got horse teeth and bow legs, and I didn't see it at the time. But this is what one has to guard against, and this is what one has to guard against in the type of activity that we're in. It's so easy to go out and try to draw people by a quick flash of emotion. And what does it get in the long run? Maybe people who have a superficial allegiance for a short period of time. But it can't hold during the medium and the long haul. It means nothing. This is the fallacy of numbers, for instance. to do what really has to be done calls for the stamina and the support to go through when the type of thing that I've been talking so carefully about this evening begins to rise as a major factor. How do you get people through that? How do you get people through that? Unless there's tremendous motivation on their part, and unless there's a great deal of real love and real support that can carry it through them. And if you can't, what is there that's meaningful? Baba was here to carry people really internally. Not, let's say, just to have 1 million or 100 million converts who wave a flag and cheer Jai Baba. No. Baba was here for life itself to illuminate the individual, as we discussed the other time from the universal message. And to illuminate the individual, it means that when the type of developmental problem that we've been talking about this evening comes up as a full challenge in the individual's life, that there shall be the resources, the determination, the stamina, the support to carry the individual and individuals through that. So a quick flash of emotion, no. I must admit, this is my temperament, and let me admit it honestly. I have a tremendous disdain for it, because it is so rare that it produces anything of any value that I can see. There are many things that, let's say, have a quick, fun value. But what we're in here for, and what Baba was in here for, was for keeps, for the long term. And this is why I feel so terribly concerned whenever I see something that looks to be a sidetracking from a long, careful, supported approach to real internal motion and development. Emotion is involved, but there's emotion and there is emotion. What I would much rather have is an individual who just has to do what he does, because he knows inside of himself there is no other choice. It's got to be done this way. A person who has been, let's say, grounded to a point where he knows what reality is, and every time that he's tempted to kick over the traces, he doesn't, because he just knows so deeply and honestly inside of himself that there is no other choice, that he has got to follow through on reality. But always, then, let me bring back to the point where there has to be, let's say, the element of fun and spontaneity and relaxation in life as the contrast and as the resource giving. But no, as far as basic motivation is concerned, until one gets to the point where one can start to see God himself or have real relationship with the Baba, it has to come from one's own deep internal driving conviction there is no other way. This is what I've got to do. But one can have spontaneity as a leavening agent in it.